We are back. Welcome to No Big Deal, Season 4, where we are welcoming Alex Harris from Cooper Software. What happens when you have the courage to walk away from a major deal? In this episode, Alex Harris reveals how qualifying out of a major enterprise deal actually led to closing the contract. Now, with Alex, we're going to really learn how to stick to your guns when you know your sales process works, and how to turn detractors into champions along the way. Tune in, roll the intro.
I'm going to take it from the top. There's two ways that you can let us know how you want us to start. One, tell us how the deal started. Like you mentioned, there was an outbound sourced op and there was a bit of a conflict internally. Can you tell us about that to start? But before you do that, can you just tell us about what a deal did for you, what it meant for you, what you learned from it in its sort of like headline format?
Yeah, I think for me, it was probably the most complex deal I've ever worked on from an A perspective. But it also taught me a lot about sticking to your guns when you know something's not quite right and you need to do something about it to get the deal back on track. And that was primarily around qualifying out to qualify back in, I think. Very uncomfortable at the time, but probably the main thing I learned. And ultimately, obviously, fantastic revenue on the board and a big strategic deal for the region as well back in Q4.
And commission.
Well, that's a bit of that as well.
On that point about like sticking to your guns, I find that's true. Sticking to your guns when you're talking to the customer, but also talking to internally. Like you have uncomfortable conversations with your VP, with the CRO. Sometimes they're telling you what to do, and you're like, "I think you're wrong," and I'm going to have to tell you. And that's equally as hard as telling that to the customer.
Yeah, for sure. I think obviously sometimes leadership give you the opportunity to make the decisions yourself, right? And they want you to make the decision. And if you make mistakes, then you make mistakes and you learn from them, right? But in this case, it was very much a big deliberation internally around what we should do, and when tough junction arrived, what do we do, and how do we approach it, and what do we think? And we kind of laid it out on the table, and these are the benefits of doing this, these are the benefits of doing this, and perhaps these are things that could happen if we end up in this situation, and these are all things that we could go wrong. And I think ultimately we kind of arrived at the decision that was the best decision, and it ultimately did end well with the deal being closed.
Quick one from me. If you like what you're hearing today, head over to nobigdeal.club. You'll find a whole host of other episodes on there. You'll also find the No Big Deal Manifesto. The manifesto is a breakdown of every lesson we've learned from all the guests we've had on the show. It'll give you tips, tricks, frameworks, guidelines, templates on how to open, manage, and close your biggest deal. Check it out. And hey, introduce this podcast to your friends. It's the easiest way for us to grow and get more great guests on for future episodes. Back to the episode. Okay, cool. Tell us, how did it start?
Yeah, so I think, there's obviously that outbound opportunity that came about. Worked quite closely with my SDR, who actually identified this as a kind of a hot prospect account. We noticed some buying signals as well. Started to hire some people into the functions that we typically sell into. And the US did try to get their hands on it, but we managed to bring it back into Europe and keep it in Europe as it obviously was HQ'd in Europe. But I think the critical point and the first thing that we worked on quite hard was we identified someone that had a genuine interest in making a difference in the organization and wanted to put themselves and their name on that. And we worked with them, and we went and saw them on site actually in the Netherlands and met them in person. And we basically just sat down with them with a point of view. Myself and the value engineer or the value consultant went on site. We took our point of view and we'd identified 5 key strategic priorities from their annual report, and we sort of validated this is what we think your business is trying to focus on. So revenue growth, risk reduction, supply chain related priorities, and there was also some compliance related stuff that they mentioned in their annual reports and publicly available information. And we basically validated that with him and said, look, this is what we think what you're focused on as a business. Here's the subset of how we think we can help support those, and then ultimately build the criteria that support those into what they should be focused on from a technology evaluation standpoint. And he told us that this is absolutely something we want to do, but we just can't do it yet. So kind of 2 years of like familiarization was the process, and then ultimately when the deal started moving, it moved very quickly. But there was a big effort from him to shape the criteria, shape the business requirements, and then ultimately take that to the business and get approval to actually go and do this.
And I suppose a big part of this deal, when we were like talking to you before we were recording, Alex, was that this was a massive deal for you, the business, but most importantly for you and your targets, right? And you had to qualify it out at one stage. Was that before or after this meeting where you went to present with this person that wanted to change?
No, so we'd had quite a lot of engagement actually with that person, and that person also made us aware that they'd hired someone that had come from a previous customer. So we'd had quite a lot of engagement with this customer, and then suddenly we're presented in a scenario where they brought some external consultants to the table that wanted to run the process. I think ultimately we realized that it wasn't going to be very easy for us to be successful if we were kind of maintained and kept in the guide rails of what they wanted to run as the process. So we had to make a bit of a tough decision around, what do we do here? Do we qualify out because we have no chance of winning because of the current conditions that this is presenting? Or do we basically say, yeah, good luck and on your way, basically? So we made a bit of a decision internally to say, yeah, you know what, under these conditions, we're not going to continue participating. At which point they came back quite quickly and said, look, guys, we need you to participate for these reasons. And we then obviously welcomed the opportunity to get back involved.
With that, what were the conditions what were the red flags that meant you wanted to say, this isn't going to work for us, we're not going to be successful?
Yeah, I think it was a very strict and restricted RFP, basically, that had very, very strict guidelines around who we can engage with, how we can engage with them, what kind of sessions were going to be run, and essentially completely deviated from your standard process that most software companies have built, right? And they know that's repeatable and they know that they can be successful in those processes. And I think the big one for us was just lack of access and time to understand the current challenges, get the requirements, build out the use cases, ultimately demonstrate the capabilities we know we can deliver on, and ultimately the criteria that we think is going to differentiate us from the competition. And I think those are the big things that were not favorable because we weren't able to get the access and the time with the customer, and we were restricted in that way that we thought, well, if we can't get the time, we can't understand what they're trying to do in more detail with all the different stakeholders that we know are going to be involved in this process, we just aren't likely going to hit the criteria and the requirements that they want to see to ultimately show how we can deliver the solution that they need for this challenge they're trying to solve.
And how did you articulate that to the customer? Like, you didn't obviously just say, sorry, Steve, we're out. Like, you probably explained it in order, because as far as but the way I would do this was I would use that as a selling opportunity. I would use the qualifying out moment as a selling opportunity to explain to them, like, the reason we do it this way is for your benefit, ABC. How did you approach that?
Yeah, I think very similar, right? So I think we positioned it very much in the customer's interest. This is why it benefits you to run the process like this, and this is why other customers have gone through this process. We do this every day, right? You probably buy software once every 5 years in some cases. So look to us as the experts who've run this process and seen other customers go through this process and see them be successful through this process and ultimately achieve the goals that you are also looking to achieve with the technology downstream, to help us help you, basically. So we kind of articulated why discovery is important and how they're going to probably identify things they don't even realize are a problem, or how additional capability from our solution is also going to provide additional value because they're not even thinking about certain modules that we currently have under our suite. And I think those things were the key things that then helped us qualify how serious they were. Because once we started to get that engagement, obviously we started to realize that we had a really good opportunity, really good alignment from a capability standpoint and criteria standpoint, and it also helped shape and build champions through that process and coaches, because we started to identify people that had a genuine interest in solving this problem, had the power and influence to do so, but also other people that wanted to solve this problem that were maybe a lower level, that wanted to give us information and help us on that process.
You mentioned at the start that you worked with a value consultant on this. What's the criteria? Well, are you at the same company now that you were working at when you closed this deal?
Yeah.
What's the criteria to work with a value consultant? Their time's obviously few and far between for most. How do you get them into your deal? What kind of information do you have to provide for them? What do they take to the deal?
Yeah, well, I think I'm very lucky that my value consultant is a bit of a weapon, I think, in terms of his ability to build compelling business cases and ultimately articulate that in the way that's connected to the right strategic objectives of the organizations. But yeah, we have a criteria of like 100K is minimum ticket. So if you're not working on a deal above 100K, basically forget getting any guidance or advice from the consultant. But we bring them in kind of hand in hand with solutions consultants from step one, So they're there to bring a different point of view, which is more around the value, whether that be efficiencies, hard savings, cost avoidance, and obviously the cost of inaction as well to an extent. And they're very much involved from the very beginning. So in Discovery, we'll have solutions consultants and value consultants, and we triangulate and we kind of play different roles. And they ask more kind of volumetrics based questions to get more of a picture on the value side of things. The solutions consultants ask more functional based questions, but they're instrumental in our deals because, what Cooper does isn't really kind of like a quick point solution that can be implemented in 2 weeks. It's a little bit bigger than that. So we need people that can help communicate the value and ultimately tell the story that the customer wants to hear and see, because every company has a different value, I guess, case that they care about, right? Whether that's savings or it's efficiencies or it's cost avoidance and maybe not having to hire more people in the future. And they're really focused on tailoring that story and that message throughout the cycle, depending on what the customer tells us.
Yeah, incredibly valuable. The part I'm interested about, Alex, is once you'd built enough pain, probably across a few departments and multiple stakeholders, clearly this business went to RFP because they realized they had a challenge that they wanted to solve. I assume then that you were in the driving seat to try, given that you were the ones to really bring this to the table with them, with the POV, to shape some form of decision criteria. Like, how did you manage that across multiple departments and multiple stakeholders?
Yeah, so I think yes and no. We were in the driving seat, yes, because we've been engaged early and we were there and we'd had good contact and we had people that had joined the organization from other customers who'd used our solution in the past. But also no, because there's kind of external consultants running the process who probably had their own RFP template that brought to the table and given that to the customer and said, this is what you should use. This is what good looks like.
Even more exciting for you.
Yeah, well, it gets tough. It gets tough when obviously that happens. So I think we focused on really understanding everyone's individual unique challenges and priorities within each of the different departments that then enabled us to show each of those different departments how we fix and solve the problems that they care about. We had specific sessions for each different department, right? Procurement, finance, IT, legal, compliance. There was dedicated sessions with all those different departments, which helped us understand what they cared about, then could help us tell them how we help solve their problems. And ultimately that got them more invested. But from a decision criteria perspective,
before you go on, how did you get those?
Yeah, I was going to ask exactly what I was going to say.
And did every business that was in the RFP get that?
So, well, there was kind of part of it was in this RFP process that they'd just designed, but we pushed really hard. And that was part of our disqualification email, which was saying, look, if we don't have the time to understand what people care about, then we're never going to be successful because we're never going to be able to show each of the different departments how we help them and how we help their specific challenges. So we pushed really hard for that and ultimately positioned it in the way that if we get that time, we'll then be able to demonstrate in the demonstrations and the solution overviews how we help solve those specific problems.
Taking a step back from that, it's really easy for the consultant to turn around and say, you're making this too big, you're making this too complex, you're trying to get to the outcomes you're trying to achieve are too far-fetched, and the methods you're trying to undertake to get there are too comprehensive, it's taking up too much. That's their argument, right? And your counter-argument to that is, yeah, we need to do this thoroughly in order to make big suggestions, in order to have big outcomes. How do you convince the customer and the consultants that you are a strategic deployment? You're a big shift in the way that the business operates. You're a big change and you're worthy of big time commitments from the customer. Instead of, no, you're just a little piecemeal thing. You're just a supplier. You're just a vendor. I'm sure if we buy it, we'll be able to plug it into the wall and turn it on. Like, how do you go about that?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that. One is big pain. Big pain is, if it's felt by enough people, is probably going to create something that means it's actually something they want to do, and enough pain is felt across the organization, they're going to get enough priority from the C-suite. I think the other part to that question is, I'm going to go completely blank on what the part of the question was now.
So it's about like, how do you get the people to listen to you and care about the shift that you want to make?
Got it, yeah, sorry. So if we go back all the way to the beginning, I think it was around building that point of view. Which was aligned to like those 5 strategic objectives, and it was like super clear 5 strategic objectives that like anyone in the business, anyone we showed that to, they were like, Yeah, that's nail on the head, like bang on, nail on the head every time. And every meeting we pretty much started, if we were presenting, we'd be starting with, here are the 5 objectives that we've identified, and they'd continue to validate, yeah, that's still the case. And even in the Steerco presentation that we did right at the end, like 3-4 days before signatures, we presented the 5 objectives that we'd captured right at the beginning, and they continue to ring true. And we continue to just say, like, how this is how we help solve those challenges. So
Did
I
you
think
present that, Alex, in like a value pyramid?
not using like a medpic value pyramid per se, but we kind of took elements of that and presented it in elements of that. And yeah, I mean, it kind of helped us stay consistent with the message we put forward throughout the whole cycle. And it also reminded everyone that this is not like technology, it's like strategic level stuff that's going to be impacted by the operational technology that they're using. Now, on the consultant side, it's a fair point. I think there's 2 parts to that, right? Consultants also want to sell more hours. So if they can get more hours out of this, then sometimes there's an ulterior motive potentially. But at the same time, we did have to kind of persuade the consultants to say, look, this is in the best interest for yourselves, because you're going to be supporting the change management post selection and implementation. If you want this to be successful, then you need to make sure that the customer understands what they're doing and why they're doing it.
And you mentioned there about like you presented your value case to the organization and people were saying like, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. How often, and maybe how frequently did this happen before this deal, and how many times did it happen afterwards? Do you get such a strong, genuine consensus from the customer that they're like, you're right? Have you learned the formula, or did you get like, or was this a one-off?
Well, firstly, one of my primary stakeholders is procurement, so very rarely does that happen because they're like, no, don't believe it. And yeah, I think this deal was like, obviously, we worked pretty hard very early on to get kind of a really good alignment to what they're trying to achieve. But I think from a value case perspective, yeah, it's a hit and miss, right? I think often if you put the work in discovery and you understand what they're trying to achieve and you really capture the metrics that they care about, and then I think you validate those, right? They have to be validated 2, 3, 4 times and probably be reduced in some cases 2, 3, 4 times until the customer goes, yeah, I buy in and I'm happy to put my name on that and say, I'm taking this to the CFO or whoever it is to put my name on this piece of paper and say, I approve of these metrics that the vendor believes that they can achieve for us.
Because that's something that we struggle to do here quite a lot, is to go from business unit to business unit with our point of view, which is slightly different from each business unit, but ultimately is a joint like direction, and get a really sound consensus from everybody that's like really robust. Some people are like, that applies to me, but not in that way, and it's slightly different. And then there's a nuance change, you go to the next one. By the time you get back full circle to where you started, it's like trying to catch water. It's like everything's a bit different to what it was at the beginning. And therefore the metrics are really hard to track. Therefore it's really hard to get like a single point of success or a single point of failure in some instances. And therefore the deals are really hard to scale. And it sounds as though in this instance, like what really made this a success was the fact that you managed to throw a blanket over everything in a way that made it scalable. So you could say, if we achieve X here, we'll also achieve X there, which means we'll also achieve X there, which means the deal grows bigger, which is what most big deals need, right? As an element of scalability of success.
Yeah, I think we focused on like relevance because we can impact so many different value levers across so many different departments. And I think it was always like, what's relevant in terms of value levers for procurement or for finance or for IT, for compliance. And it was taking a small snippet of the overarching numbers that exist and taking those ones to the different departments and saying, look, here, from a compliance standpoint, we think we can help you audit or report better and quicker because of XYZ things. For procurement, it's maybe we think we can deliver savings here and efficiencies here and a cost avoidance of not having to hire more people here. And I think it was being like relevant for the different metrics that impact the different departments, because as you say, like someone in IT probably cares very little about savings in procurement, but they care about environment complexity and growth of applications in their environment, right? So I think that was the kind of message we just tailored it, and the business case was tailored very much to different departments we spoke to.
And how did you then put that business case into the RFP? Once you've done all of this due diligence across all of the departments, like how did you collate all of that? And did it go to like a buying committee or like one central decision maker?
Yeah, so I obviously you have like your Excel templates in an RFP. I love attaching exhibits, so like additional documents they've not asked for. So like you know how in decision criteria you can get a standard list of criteria and say, yeah, we meet all of those criteria, but what about all these other things? I think that's something that like I've done in the past is attach exhibits basically, which is additional documentation and things that they don't ask for, but actually probably you're the only one out of the vendors, or maybe one of the two of the vendors that is doing that and differentiating yourself in that way. So I attached our value case to the RFP as an exhibit and basically gave them the full document, which gave a breakdown of kind of the priorities, the metrics they'd given us, so validated metrics that they'd given us in terms of what they are currently operating at, some target metrics where they're trying to get to, then ultimately the numbers, the pricing also included in there to an extent as well. And then also like a value realization journey, because we recognize that certainly in our space, people can implement our software, but they might not get 100% value in year one. They might get 25% or 50% or 75%. So it's taking them on that like 5-year journey of where they're going to get to in the 5-year journey to ensure they can kind of realize value over that period of time, but also they understand that we're being realistic. So yeah, I think attaching it to the RFP is a sort of a niche way to get it in there without maybe them asking for it.
Love it. And you mentioned as well earlier on when we were talking about there were some detractors that came in. There was an ex-user as a champion who came in. Tell us a little bit about tell us a little bit about the ex-user and like weaponizing somebody who's used it in the past and building them into a new champion midway through the deal.
Yeah, so I think they actually came in before the deal kind of really took off, and it was like that pre-work we did with them. And again, we took our point of view to them, and they kind of validated it and said, yeah, like fully agree. But crucially, they had experience. They knew what we did. They could then start communicating our value to other people in the business, because we had other individuals in the team that were evaluating us that had used other solutions and quite openly spoken about those other solutions on their LinkedIn. So I obviously was like, well, that's a risk. They talked about how they successfully implemented XYZ at XYZ company, and they'd had great success in delivering these values and these metrics. And I'm like, well, that for me is a big risk.
Tactically, what do you do in that situation when you're on a call with that person?
You got to bring it out, man.
So I did it in person. So I was actually in the office at the coffee machine in between one of our sessions. These sessions, like we had some of these long sessions were like 4 or 5 hours, like full afternoons or full mornings or whatever it was. And I just grabbed it. I was like, look, like, recognize you worked with one of our competitors in the past. Like, just curious, like, why wouldn't you do it again? Why would you not buy it again? And I think quite quickly there was a realization that it wasn't just her; it was the organization wide that were against using that solution. It was part of SAP's portfolio. They're kind of done an SAP project. They weren't particularly friendly towards future SAP projects, and I think they realized that maybe it wasn't the best fit for the organization. So addressed it pretty early, but in a kind of softer way, not like in a call with everyone else and be like, by the way, you've used this software. What are you?
Yeah.
Why are you
It's the David Foreman elevator questions, isn't it?
Yeah. Also,
I don't know if you did. Yeah, I was going to say, did you do that like just instinctively? That wasn't like a planned thing. You were like, I'm going to ask her there, or was it just like, oh, maybe I should just ask her?
I think I spoke to my colleagues about it. I was like, oh god, this person's joined. Like, they've gone and they've worked at this company before. They've used it, and we kind of were like, well, yeah, let's see how things go. But the more senior champions or more senior people in the business haven't used that software before and haven't come from that organization. So let's see. But also I think it was an opportunity to differentiate how we do things versus how they do things in that previous system they've used. And we just talked a lot about, you may have used X, Y, Z in the past. In a lot of our demos, like, oh, well, some of you may have used other solutions. You may have noticed that this was the way you used to do it. Well, this is how we do it in Cooper. And just talked about the differences and never necessarily named the competition specifically, but just talked a lot about the difference and how we do things differently. And often it was like, oh, wow, that's quite a lot more slick, or that's a lot better, or yeah, I kind of prefer the way you're doing it versus what I've done in the past.
I think you can generally see it as a bit of a positive. My first initial reaction is actually to think, oh shit. But then my second one is to think, actually, they're a champion of solving the pain.
Yeah, they're a champion of buying this solution.
Buying this solution to solve a pain that we're also in that market of.
You haven't got to go through the education, or Alex, as you called it earlier, familiarization, which I think is really important, which is the longest part of the deal.
Yeah.
The
The
education,
hardest part.
the hardest part is taking them from
Hardest
stage to
part.
first purchase, and they've already done that.
Yeah, I think also the other thing as well is you never know. Like they may speak about it positively on LinkedIn, but they may have had a bad experience. Like you just don't know, right? Everyone can say good things about solutions, or they may have had a good experience, but actually towards the end, or they may have actually not had that positive experience, that much of a positive experience overall. So I think the ultimate sort of result was that yeah, she was indifferent about the solution she used in the past. While she'd had some good success with it, she wasn't really that bothered about it in the future.
I really like the way you asked the question as well. Why haven't you just gone and bought that? It's almost like we're in on this together. I know you could have just gone and rung your old friend and said, "Do you want to just get a deal done?" And you haven't done that yet. Therefore, you must have some concerns about them. Do you want to share them with me? But I like that way you asked it. And
I'm just
then
going to pull my blind down, by the way, just because the sun's hitting me right in the face. Just 2 seconds. There we go.
the other question I have is about turning detractors into champions, and something that we all have to do. I've got a pilot running at the moment. I've got about 30 people in the platform, and there's 25 of them are really positive, 2 or 3 of them are indifferent, and then there's 1 or 2 of them I'm just like, I know that you're bringing the house down from the inside. I know that you're making things difficult for me behind closed doors. How did you go about, especially because these consultants are ultimately acting like detractors, how did you go about uncovering what's really important to them, finding out the wins for them, and like you turning it?
Yeah, so I think if I kind of put myself in their shoes, right? As a consultant, if I'm running an evaluation process, like what do I care about, and what am I trying to achieve for the customer? So I think firstly is finding the right solution for the customer, because that's what the customers brought them in to do, right? The second part is we kind of spent quite a bit of time with them trying to understand what happens once technology is selected, and it turns out that they were going to support them in the implementation, not necessarily implementing the software, but managing kind of the project and the change management and the overall kind of, I guess, direction of the project post-sale. So the next thing is then, will they care about this being successful? And if they're making a recommendation, or they're at least guiding the customer on this journey, they need to be sure that this is going to work and it's going to deliver the results that they anticipate. Because if not, they're on the chopping block. Because if the customer's not making the decision themselves internally, the consultant's making the decision, then the C-suite are probably going to look to them and go, hey, you selected this, it didn't work, you're fired, basically. And I think that was when they started to sort of open up a little bit and try to actually fully understand that, yes, this is going to work, and they wanted to make sure and validate with us that this is going to work and it's going to be successful. And I think the time we spent with them, helping them understand more about our solution, building them into pseudo champions or pseudo coaches, was really where we started to, I guess, see a bit of a difference. That said, we still had difficult conversations, right? Because there was always difficult points in the conversation where we didn't agree on things, or they wanted to do things differently. But we overcame that, and I think ultimately they'll probably continue to support us in the future with other customers that they may be working with.
So not even just turning them into a champion, almost turn them into a partner.
Yeah, well, they like to be independent, but I think potentially a partner in the future.
The final bit of the deal that I really want to get into is around like mutual close plans. And we've even discussed earlier, I know that you closed this deal the week before Christmas, and you said 4 days before you even closed the deal, you were still presenting the POV and the strategic pillars. So I know we talked like the mutual close plan was like really important. What was your approach to creating that plan with the customer? And how did you establish accountability from them and maintain momentum as well?
Yeah, so well, I think the first thing was like they had a deadline of when they wanted to be live by. So that was obviously a great thing, because sometimes customers don't know when they want to be live, or they're kind of like, oh yeah, 6 months time, a year's time, whatever, and it's a bit difficult because then you can't tie them back from there. But they knew pretty clearly that they were tying towards kind of pre-summer of this year being live and being operational. So we just worked back straight out the gates, worked back from there. Okay, and I worked with my professional services team that were kind of building out the SOW and what the professional services project was going to look like. And we just worked back really hard from there and agreed that if they wanted to get to where they wanted to get to, they needed to sign before Christmas, so that they could kick off the project in early Jan, and they could then take things forward from there. And I think we had a bit of a compressed timeline to work towards, which meant that it kind of helped move things quickly. Meeting scheduling and everything else kind of meant that there was no blockers. We can't do things for 2 weeks if someone's holiday. Like, things carried on when other people were out or people weren't able to support meetings. Things carried on because there was a known deadline they were working towards, that if they wanted to meet their go live deadline, they had to do something before Christmas. So we early on set the 18th of December as like a date that we were working towards, and everything we did was always working back from that date. And even like 2 weeks before we signed, we had like a legal meeting where we basically just, all we talked about was the signature process. Like, how does this go from getting uploaded into DocuSign to getting signed to getting approved, whatever, the whole process. Because there was 2 like parallel processes. There was an approval process that had to go through like an internal approval system, and then there was a signature process. And we basically defined everything really clearly early on, so we knew everything that had to happen, so there was no possibility of delay downstream.
There must have been a deal in the past where that went badly for you to be that thorough.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously everyone has like deals that slip, right? It's just the nature of the game we play in. But I think it was probably also the customer also had the desire to be very thorough because they knew they couldn't miss the deadline pre-Christmas. And I had a couple of people that were kind of working with me very closely from the customer side. We were like on Teams speaking pretty much every day. I mean, I was in Amsterdam like every week for like 6 weeks, basically, in the run up to this deal closing. But yeah, it was, I don't think there's anything specifically in the past, but I just got very watertight on it because there was such a hard deadline from the customer side.
You had such an amazing champion by the sounds of it. And you worked so closely and well with them. It's the cornerstone of any good deal, really. One final question, I think, before we talk through like that final moment of the deal. What did you do in this deal, sort that we haven't spoken about, that was like quite exceptional? Because it's obviously a very good deal and it's obviously very well run. Is there anything that we haven't discussed? What don't we know about?
Yeah, I think there's probably two things. So on-site presence, I was not afraid to be there, and it was pretty draining, I won't lie. But like every week, pretty much for like 6 weeks in the crunch time of the deal, I was there on site. Whether that's like a planning meeting, whether that's like demo meeting, discovery meeting, even if like not many of the stakeholders were going to be there in the office, I was like, no, it's all right, I'll be there in the office, like trying to have those conversations off the record where there wasn't a meeting or there wasn't a recorded call going on. That's one thing. And then I think the other thing was getting outside of your normal communication channels like email. Like, I pushed really hard to get on Teams with everyone. Like, I was chatting on Teams pretty much like they were internal colleagues. And I think those two things differentiated probably from maybe the competition, because I don't know how many times the competition was on site. I don't think it was as many times as we were. I don't think they were probably speaking to them on like a day-to-day basis like they were colleagues on Teams. And I think those sort of things differentiated because it helped just shape things significantly in our favor through that process.
Classic things we hear a lot, Jack. Right?
The on-site face-to-face and like getting phone numbers and Slack and Teams gets you so far ahead of the competition.
Actually, I think, sorry, one of the things as well is like, so one of my champions, I had like probably 3 core champions in the deal. One of them, kind of, I had to lean on him quite hard towards the end where it was getting a bit tight, and I had to have a hard conversation. I was like, look, like, we need this to happen because of both of us need this to happen. And I think it was not being afraid of very, very last minute to have a bit of a tough conversation and be like, look, this is like crunch time. We need this to happen. Both of us do. And I think some people may be a bit afraid of like having that pretty tough conversation right at the wire, just in case it pisses them off or puts them in a place where they don't want to do it. And they're like, well, actually, out of spite, I'm just not going to do it now because I don't want to do it. So yeah, so probably the final thing I'd add.
The question I was actually going to ask, maybe answered in that way, but I was going to say, looking back at the whole deal, like, was there a pivotal moment in the deal where you thought, fuck, this is going to go either way?
Yeah, actually. So the they put like a decision call in our diary, like a vendor of choice decision call. And it was like a whole
out of the blue.
no. So not out of the blue, but like they were like, oh, we're gonna make a decision, like, and it got delayed a couple of days. And I was like, oh, it's just delayed. Like that doesn't bode well. Like if someone's delaying decisions, like maybe someone else has been selected. And they sent us an invite, and I think I had me and my manager on the call at the time. And they're all sat there in the boardroom. And this is one time I wasn't on site because they'd like sent the call quite last minute. So I'm like, oh god, like if they're all in the boardroom and I'm not there, like it's probably bad news. And I get on the call and like, hey, it's all kind of like a bit of an awkward, like, oh, so like, what are we gonna talk about? Is this good or is this bad news? And the call was in for an hour, and I was like, well, that's either a good sign or a bad sign that it's like an hour and they want to give us feedback, or it's an hour and they actually want to talk about the next steps. So then we get on, and the main champion starts speaking and sort of like starts talking about the process, and I'm like, oh god, like just get over it, done with it, just tell me what's happening. And then eventually he's like, yeah, look, like we're delighted to announce that you're like our vendor of choice and we'd like to continue the next steps with you. And I was just like, sigh of relief, like thank god for that. But it doesn't mean that it's happened, right? I think that was the moment at which it was like, okay, yeah, we're going somewhere here, because we've been very much kept in a lane, and we weren't really given much feedback or guidance throughout because the consultants were running the process.
Well, you've got to hold your nerve at that point as well. Like keep it straight.
Well, because most prospects hide behind an email, right? They just send you an email like, oh, you're not vendor of choice, or you're vendor of choice, basically. And it would
sometimes not even that.
Even an email sometimes, yeah. Love it.
But it was kind of all in the boardroom. It was quite weird.
I'm just trying to think if there's anything that we've missed. It sounds as though you've run like a really, really watertight, comprehensive, like value-based deal. Which is exactly
is there anything like looking back at it you would think you took from that deal that you now do differently?
Yeah, I think there is like one thing looking back actually, and it's around managing like third-party consultants in processes. I think so. I previously was always like, don't want to deal with them because it's like bad news for salespeople, right? I think you have to treat them like another stakeholder that you kind of need to build into a champion, and you need to build them into their own champion in their own right, and empower them to be selling on your behalf when you're not in the room. I think sometimes salespeople may get kind of, I guess, may just try and push them to the side or try and go around them because they don't want to work with them. And actually sometimes that can really hurt you. I think that's probably the biggest learning is that I do differently is probably empower them and go and run at them and try and help them as much as possible from day one.
I think that's true of anyone who's a potential detractor, really, isn't it? It's like they're equally, if not more important to uncover early on. Than champions are, because they're going to be. It's easy. Say one is they love you, two is they indifferent, three is they don't like you, and four is they hate you. It's easier to turn a 4 to a 1 than it is a 3 or a 2 to a 1. 3s and 2s are always like, nah, don't really give a shit either way. 4s are like, I passionately feel a certain way about you.
Yeah,
we skipped over the part where you said you had 3 champions as well.
No.
I was like, yeah, I called up one of my 3 champions that I had to have a hard conversation.
Well, so total number of stakeholders we had was like involved in calls and involved in the process, probably about 35 people. So it's like a lot of people to deal with. And some calls you join, there's like, because there's a lot of US people as well. So there was people dialing in from the US, and they're obviously all remote, right? And everything's been run out of Europe. It's like there's sometimes a bit of a cultural difference. Yeah. So yeah, there was some challenges managing those kind of like big rooms of Zoom calls with like just hundreds of people on the call. It's like, what do you do here? How do you manage the people that aren't in the room?
You must have looked like such a boss when it signed on the day you said it was going to sign.
Yeah, well, it did get to 5:30, and I was like, oh god, like that's 6:30 in Europe. Like,
yeah,
that happen.
Forecast accuracy, Alex Harris.
Well, yeah. So I think the only thing we didn't discuss was like exec sponsorship and exec alignment, because that's something that we did do a lot of, and I actually had my chief procurement officer like aligned to their chief like head of procurement, and we had other exec sponsors internally as well reach out to them as well to like really drive the kind of mutual alignment piece, and I had then 2 exec sponsors on the steerco, which I presented because we presented to the steering committee, and that was like full of exec team members and others in the committee. And I think our execs also presented and told their story on that as well. So kind of brought those in and aligned to the necessary execs on their side as well.
God, mate, honestly, this is like, well, me and Jack, clearly we wrote the Big Deal Manifesto, but this is pretty much like, I would say chapter for chapter, how to effectively run a strategic enterprise deal.
Yeah, 100%.
Pretty much.
Oh, thank you.
This is bulletproof. Alex, what's your favourite sales memory?
Ooh, probably my first deal. Just like, I think it's like the thrill of like the first deal you ever close, like seeing that DocuSign. I think that's probably. I think I remember like going out that night and going mad. So it wasn't even that big of a deal. But like, I recently moved from an SDR into an AE role. I was like, yeah, this is cool.
Yeah, you're like, I've made it, Mom.
Yeah, and it's like when you sign like the big deals, it's like, oh, thank God that's
Yeah,
over.
it's so true.
Please, I'm drained. Like, thanks, the pain is over. It's relief. It's not enjoyment, isn't it? With the big ones.
100%.
Awesome, mate. Really appreciate you coming on. Thanks a lot.
No worries at all.
That's class. Thanks.
There you have it. Thanks so much for listening. Alex's strategic approach to enterprise selling proved transformative, as hopefully you've heard there. From building a bulletproof value narrative to weaponizing on-site presence and moving communication to teams, these tactics created the differentiation needed to win this big logo. Remember, sometimes walking away is the exact move that brings the customer right back to the table. Thanks for listening. And again, no big deal.